if you look at Eddie, Ayn Rand's description of him is that he has the habit of looking straight into people's eyes. They're blue, I'm reading it here, but their eyes are wide blue, questioning. And he has an unscrupulous attentiveness, an open, puzzled wonder. Eddie is fact focused. He's somebody who's your average man, but he's an average moral man. He's wonderful. And I wondered, I thought we could bring up first the opening of the book, the whole idea of the twilight. Eddie talks about the twilight. What is the significance of that type of time of night for him? And what is it? It's basically bringing up a malevolence within him. And I wondered if both of you would speak to that.
Speak to the malevolence in
malevolence. He hates the twilight. It's like a causeless uneasiness within him, a dread without reason, this diffuse apprehension. That's how Ayn Rand is starting it. There's a raindrop that looks like a question mark, and he feels betrayed. And of course, that moves us into the oak tree. But I wondered, he's wondering, betrayed by whom? Not himself, nor his trust. So right at the beginning, Ayn Rand paints him as somebody who's not questioning himself. He's not filled with neurosis. He feels confident, but there's something out there in the world that's very troubling to him. And he sees the contrast in the scenes, the white curtain, which brings him that sense of benevolence. And he sees that all of the cracks in the buildings, every fourth store closed. He's just seeing the world start to crumble. So either one of you could speak to that.
Shoshana, they say ladies first. Do you wanna speak first?
Well, I guess I can speak first. I think that what we have in the novel, in effect, is that Eddie Willers, after he hears from the bum the question, who is John Galt, Eddie Willers speaks first because we're introduced to his mind. See, one of the really interesting aspects of the way that he's presented is that we get a lot about Eddie Willers from the inside. And so in a way, even though you start this book and you think, well, this is not Howard Roark from The Fountainhead, he's obviously very, very different, but he's a means of access for us into the book through the way that we see how his mind works. Now, what you were just saying, Ellen, is that something bothers him about that time of day. Well, sometimes Eddie Willers doesn't know why he feels what he feels. And yet we see how he sees things. He sees, oh, this is a prosperous street. Only a few of the stores are closed. Well, in a really prosperous street, all of the stores would be open. And so that's his perspective, is that this is pretty good for a street. And in these times. So it's an introduction to Eddie Willers in these times. And we see that Eddie Willers knows that something bothers him about that, who is John Galt, but he hasn't quite pinned it down what bothers him. And he does give the bum the money, and why, why? And well, he's got questions. Here's a question, but it's a question without an answer. And it bothers him, but he doesn't get to the bottom of it. And then he sees that calendar and he's got a concern about that. Oh yeah, that means something. What is it? And it isn't until later that he figures out what it is. So part of, I think, what's wonderful about Eddie Willers in the sense of his psychology is that we get access to it. And you were mentioning, the oak tree, and that this, well, we can discuss what that image means, but we're told what the meaning was of that. So he's someone who had an experience in the past that meant something to him, and it had to do with how he evaluated something that he saw. And then we just turn the page, and there's a parallel to what we were just told about his state of mind, right? That he used to feel that oak tree would be there forever. Here he is, Taggart Transcanal. It's going to be there forever. Oops, and yet Eddie Willers doesn't make that connection any more than he figures out about that the calendar means your days are numbered until he hears someone else say it. So he's not stupid, but he's also someone who doesn't always understand the connections that his mind is making. And I think that's interesting, and as we said, we meet him at the beginning, and we were going to tell people that if you haven't read Atlas Shrugged, you really had better read it, because it's a unified book. It's very hard to talk about it without giving away solutions to the mystery, and it is a mystery. So without actually telling you the whole story, we do start with him, and the book proper ends with him, and then there's kind of an epilogue. And so he's not Howard Rourke, and yet he's someone who's honest and who, as you say, asks questions even if he doesn't always know how to get to the answers. And I think that makes him a really good entry point for us into the book. Andy.
Yeah, I think we need to point out that Eddie Willers morally is a good man. I mean, he's committed to the same values as the other heroes in Atlas Shrugged are, to industrial civilization, to human prosperity, to rationality as the means to promote these things. He's morally the equal of all the heroes in this. So I don't see any way to discuss these characters without plenty of spoilers. Yeah, so I'm going to say right now, for anybody who hasn't read Atlas Shrugged, maybe you want to turn us off, go read the book, and then come back to the series, because there's going to be a number of spoilers here. There's no way to avoid it. I think Eddie Willers is as morally upright as John Galt and as Dagny. He's as committed to rationality and to promoting human life on Earth as are the great heroes, but he doesn't have their prowess. Many of the heroes in Atlas Shrugged are geniuses, and Eddie isn't. But he's committed to life on Earth. He at some gut level or some subconscious level, he realizes his values are under attack. Human prosperity, human freedom are under attack. He's not Dagny Taggart or John Galt. He can't understand. He's just not that kind of intellect to understand the deeper causes, and he knows himself well enough to know that he couldn't do it. He couldn't do anything about it. It was like when much later in the book, when the train breaks down in the desert, Eddie doesn't leave the train, even though everybody else does, because Ayn Rand symbolizing he's committed to industrial civilization and the benefits it brings to life on Earth. He stays with the abandoned train now, but he can't fix it. If it was Dagny, the engineer, she could fix the engine. If it was John Galt, he'd invent a whole new one. But Eddie's not that guy. He can't do it. But he's living in a world that's crumbling. He recognizes that is. He knows he can't do anything about it, not by himself. And so the sense of foreboding is understandable. If this was Dagny or Reardon or Galt, they probably wouldn't have a sense of foreboding. They would have the same recognition that Eddie has, but they have much more ability than he does. They have much more confidence in their ability to fight it. They might feel a strong sense of purpose or even a righteous sense of outrage against the bad guys. But Eddie, it's understandable that Eddie would feel foreboding. He can't understand. He senses the evil. He can't understand it. He can't do anything about it, and he knows he can't do anything about it. Foreboding is a very, very appropriate emotion for him in this context.
Well, I think that part of what's true is that if Eddie Willers knows who the bad guys are when he runs into them, he doesn't look at evil people and think, well, they're not so bad. He doesn't understand evil maybe all the way down, but which is why he gets so frustrated, and it isn't fair, and it isn't fair, it isn't right, and he screams about that. And that's, of course, part of his honesty, is that when he sees something, he makes an evaluation. I think that what you were saying of contrasting him with, Dagny, with Galt, with Reardon, it comes through in one of the things that we know he said in childhood when he and Dagny talked about how Francisco made them feel. And he said, Francisco makes me feel safe. And Dagny said, he makes me expect excitement and danger. And it's not that they're seeing two different Franciscos,
right?
But Dagny doesn't need anyone else to make her feel safe. And Eddie does.
Right.
Eddie can't make himself safe all by himself. And I think that that's an element of him all the way through. And in an early scene, he talks about himself. He's got a friend in the at Taggart Transcontinental. He talks to in the cafeteria, and he says that he's not any kind of a great man, and that he couldn't make a railroad if anything happened to it, and that's the sort of thing that Dagny could do. Now, I think that what we do see is that as the story goes along, he does do what he can within his abilities and within his skills, and absolutely with honesty. You know, that's why the expression moral integrity is a really good one for him. That he's all of a piece. He's not a hypocrite. The other way to look at it, of course, is that, well, he has picked a good profession for himself, and with helping Dagny, being a kind of bodyguard for her, being someone who understands the railroad to the extent that he can and can be on her side, which is why when she's later on in the plot steps away and she wants him to be her replacement because he's honest, he'll do things to the extent that he can the way that she would.
Right.
And he understands that. I mean, he knows who the good guys and the bad guys are.
Right. And well, you know, he doesn't fully understand the bad guys. The minister had told him that what's good, and you know, you want to do right in life. And so Eddie wants to do right, but he's not quite sure what it is, what his standards are. But he can't imagine anybody wanting to do wrong. And toward the end of the second part, he meets somebody who he doesn't meet them, but James Taggart lashes out at him when after the tunnel disaster. I know we're skipping ahead here, but James lashes out at him, and he's that Eddie was his object of hatred because Eddie represented Dagny, and Dagny was the real object of hatred for James. And so Eddie said, you know, James says, "Where is Dagny?" And he says, you know, that he knows, but I won't tell you. And he says, "But you're violating rules. I'll have this and that happen to you." And he says, "Yeah, okay." So he's got this moral confidence that he has throughout the book, but it really gets strong for him, just as it parallels with the other heroes and heroines, that they grow in their role too. And when he sees James, he said that that people were feeling fear, but Eddie, the face of Eddie Willers, I have it here. Eddie looked lifelessly. He had this lifelessly conscious glance of a scholar confronted with a field he never wanted to study, evil in people. He knew it existed, but he takes in the facts of James, and he's horrified by it. But he has that confidence. The other thing that I wanted to say with the oak, well, I'll pause here in case you guys want to jump in on that.
Well, thank you, Dr. Kenner. And Dr. Milgram, there's something I wanted to say here, and I think, you know, Ayn Rand's making an important point about moral character in the person of Eddie Willers, and he's an analog to Mike Donegan in The Fountainhead, because you know Mike Donegan, of course, a construction worker, and he is not a genius like Howard Rourke. But he's, in terms of the moral principles of The Fountainhead, independence, which is the virtue Ayn Rand is dramatizing in The Fountainhead. In terms of independence, Mike Donegan is as independent as Howard Rourke. He's not as intelligent as Howard Rourke. He's not the genius Howard Rourke is. But, you know, Ayn Rand shows us that, you know, society thought Guy Franken was a great architect, and Mike Donegan sees with his own eyes, understands with his own mind that Guy Franken's a phony. Society's rejected Henry Cameron, but Mike Donegan knows Henry Cameron's, you know, a great architect. Similarly with the Rourke and Keating contrast. So we see Ayn Rand showing, you know, that with the character of Mike Donegan, that the most important characteristic of human beings, character, is democratic. It's open to everybody. Every man and every woman could be just as moral as the geniuses. And of course, Ellsworth too, he's probably a lot more intelligent than Mike Donegan, but he's evil incarnate. And so there's no correlation between intelligence and character. And similarly in Atlas Shrugged, Robert Stadler's a genius and early in his life did a lot of good things, but he devolves into a monster. Well, Eddie Willers doesn't approximate Stadler's intelligence, but he is morally committed to what makes human life on Earth possible. He's a builder. He's not a destroyer, and he's passionately committed to it. And he stand up for it, and even to the death, he refuses to go off in a covered wagon and leave, industrial civilization behind. So Ayn Rand's key point here is that moral character, the most important quality any human being has, is democratic. It's open to everybody. It's volitional. It's all about the choices we make, not whatever abilities we're born with. John Galt, presumably, I'm guessing here. I'm not a scientist, but I'm guessing that there's some neurological basis of intelligence, how many neurons are firing in somebody's brain or whatever. Well, that's the case. John Galt is just born with a brain that's just off the charts. I mean, he's Aristotle and Newton and Thomas Edison all rolled up into one. I mean, he's just an extraordinary giant. And Eddie Willis is everywhere. But morally, they're on an equal footing, and the geniuses recognize that. Francisco said, that the Taggart children were not James and Dagny. The Taggart children are Dagny and Eddie, and I think Dagny regards Eddie as her younger brother, and so that you see that the genius is, and John Galt, of course, knows that he's been pumping him for information, but I think he respects Eddie for being morally upright. But certainly Dagny and Francisco, and Rhiannon too. Rhiannon also knows, that Eddie is a good man. So it's an important moral principle that Ayn Rand's showing here, and I think it often gets overlooked, and certainly by Ayn Rand's critics who say she's writing about the elites. Well, she is. The elites carry us forward. The elites make human life possible. But she's showing that in terms of moral character, every man and every woman has the same opportunity to be a moral paragon as do the geniuses.
Well, I think though that with Eddie, it's completely true what you said, especially when you look at him next to the bad guys, because the bad guys, they say one thing, they mean something else. They say, it seems to me, it looks, and so on. And Eddie is fact oriented, which is one of the reasons why when Cheryl is trying to find out the truth about who built the John Galt line, Eddie's the one she goes to, and he just tells it to her. So he's got a lot of virtues. What I think we also see though, when we look at him from the inside, which Ayn Rand allows us to do, is that there are times when he could do better than he does. I mean, for example, as we already had the spoiler alert, so it should not be a surprise to you, and readers of the book probably know it before Eddie does, that Eddie's been in love all his life with Dagny. Okay, now how does he miss that piece of news about himself? I think, how does he not know? And of course, I mean, it's a function of the story and so on. And when he realizes it hits him, and he doesn't say, "Oh, gee, I missed that." But it's a very big thing about his character, not in the moral sense, but in the sense of what he knows about himself.
Well, I think he has a bit.
Yeah, it lacks a certain level of introspective awareness.
Yeah,
that's what I was going to say, that he gets angry at himself when he remembers the oak tree. He gets angry at himself. He gets angry at himself in the scene that you're describing in the bedroom, because he holds, like Hank does, a little bit of the mind-body dichotomy. I thought I love the railroad, but I also love her, but it wasn't, and also he feels a bit guilty. And Eddie's coping strategy is to stop the thought, straighten his shoulders, and reassume self-discipline. So you get this he's lonely too. She says something about his life, but instead of saying the word life, his quiet existence, his lonely, quiet existence, rather than the word life. And he's so dedicated and singularly focused on loving everything that railroad means to him. And I see it as the benevolent universe premise, with Dagny included and all the heroes and heroines. And that
well, it's also how he makes friends with the worker, because the worker is someone who has the same love for the railroad. But even there, he doesn't ask the guy's name.
Right. But yeah, go ahead.
And he just uses him as someone to express himself to, and which is something that he needs, because he's got Dagny to work with, but he wants to have with Dagny also. I think that he doesn't reveal himself or some of his worries in the same way that he does here, because he doesn't want to burden her. So
Yeah, the
Yeah,
skill of introspection. And that was it too. The one person that he uses as kind of a diary or a journal or a friendship, the one mind is much more than a diary or journal, because it's an actual human with an intense interest in the very thing that he's interested in, is the worker in the cafeteria. And he just opens up. He even opens up about his discovery about
Mhm.
that Dagny and Hank Reardon are together when he's in her bedroom.
And I think that it would be good for Eddie to ask himself some of the questions that he doesn't ask, because well, all the way through the book, it happens sometime. It happens to Dagny, to Reardon, that something is on their minds, and then back to work. And instead of examining why they've got concerns about something, it's back to it, because work is always important. And well, work is always important. And in this book, work is important. Life work is important. And for Eddie Willers, he actually does have work to do that is important. But it's also true that if you kind of play it through from the standpoint of his confiding in the worker, he tells the worker things that actually, in the short range, are working against the railroad.
Oh, absolutely.
She really needs McNamara. Then you turn the page, McNamara quit. Oh, well, she's got this good Dwight Sanders. Dwight Sanders is gone.
Right.
Right.
So Andy, you want to jump in?
Well, yeah, the way John Galt pumps Eddie for information, throughout the story, and with Eddie not suspecting everything. Again, he's not. I don't want to insult his intelligence. He's certainly intelligent enough to do an important job efficiently, and he's certainly intelligent enough, perceptive enough to recognize who the bad guys are and to recognize what they're doing to American culture and how they're destroying the society. His understanding of people, I think, his psychological awareness, both introspectively and of others, I think is limited, as you've just pointed out. He's
I think it's implicit. He doesn't bring it. He doesn't ask himself the questions, but he knows, as you said at the beginning, knows James Taggart is evil, and everyone's, all the evil people are evil. He knows that.
Yeah, it's interesting because he's like intellectually aware regarding moral issues, and he's very good. And two thumbs up for Eddie morally. He's an upright man, but he's not nearly as intellectually aware regarding psychological issues and regarding interpersonal issues. And Shoshana brought out an important point. I mean, he's been in love with Dagny for a long time, and he just realized it when he finds out that she and Hank Reardon are lovers. He's in his early 30s. So I mean, yeah, that kind of feeling he should be aware of. And similarly with the relationship with John Galt, I think he recognizes that John Galt, at a deeper level than what Galt is doing to the railroad, that Dagny's Eddie's unaware of. And at some deeper level, this is a man that can be trusted. This is a man, even though he's pumping me, even though it turns out he's pumping him for information to destroy the railroad, at a deeper level, what John Galt, of course, is preeminently doing is saving American civilization, which is, Eddie's, certainly enormous value for Eddie. But Eddie's not aware of I think of the dynamics of the relationship, what the relationship is really all about. So somebody that one of you mentioned, he doesn't even ask the guy's name, which would be a big, presumably John Galt would answer honestly, tell him John Galt, and he would go, what? He doesn't even ask his name. So there's a certain lack of awareness regarding interpersonal relationships and introspection and human psychology, that an unawareness an awareness he doesn't lack regarding moral assessments, which it's an interesting dichotomy in his character.
Well, I think that he does his job, when he has his job to do, he has certain tasks, but say even the task of maintaining the friendship with the worker, he looks for him and he expects to find him. And of course, John Galt is hanging out there waiting for his information. So it's not actually an accident, but Eddie doesn't sort of think, well, this is a bright spot in my life. I could milk this. I could make this better. Instead, he lets it happen. And I think similarly, he doesn't think about what would make me, what other than the railroad can I do that would advance my life? So I think moral integrity is good for him because he's all of a piece, but it's also true that he's not as active
mentally
in some of the questions he could ask, as active intellectually and on his own behalf as one might wish he would be. As I think Mike is. Mike finds good jobs to work on, and Mike is more of a grown-up, I guess. But
Mike Donegan in the Fountain.
Yeah, Mike Donegan, right.
Let me make one, Ellen, before you jump in, one other point about Eddie that's interesting, that he meets John Galt in the first place because he chooses to eat in the workers' cafeteria rather than in the executive cafeteria.
Yes.
Where he is entitled to be. And so, you wonder, I mean, it's similarly to like Howard Rourke in The Fountainhead was a construction worker, and one of his buddies, Mike Donegan, of course, is a construction worker. And then is there a belief, and I'm speculating here, is there a belief that the blue collar guys, the people who actually do the building and stuff, make the railroad run at a physical level or actually construct the building, that these are honest guys doing an honest day's work? That Jim Taggart mentality may be more pervasive in the amongst the executives than it is amongst the blue collar guys. And Eddie, the morally upright man, the honest man, may feel, for that reason, may feel more comfortable, with the blue collar guys than in the executive cafeteria. So I'm just speculating there, but it fits his character.
Well, I think that by the time we get into the novel, John Galt has been busy for a while, and so I can't imagine that all of the executives were James Taggart like for a long time, or else the railroad would have gone under.
Right,
now there's Dagny who's running it, but I'm guessing like Owen Kellogg and various other people could have been collected before, and just that then they're not around anymore.
Yeah, no, you're absolutely right. But I was just wondering if Jim Taggart's spirit, the head of the railroad, the president, if it's more pervasive amongst the executives and in their, in their dining area than it is amongst the blue collar guys. And
people he feels comfortable with.
Yeah, well definitely honest. To actually make the railroad run physically. If the track breaks down, you got to fix the track. you got to do the job. There's no being able to double talk your way around it. And so these guys are more in touch with perceptual level reality. They're more in touch with reality and less the corrupt philosophy of the Washington bureaucrats that Jim Taggart is consorts with. So that's why I'm just speculating. I think
well, and I think we know the engineers and the when Dagny puts out the call for volunteers for the first run of the John Galt line, everybody those are all people who understand what's at stake here and want to be part of that, as opposed to the James Taggart and his friends who want Dagny out of the way.
Right. Well, and go back to your earlier point, Shoshana, when Cheryl continues to investigate, what's really the truth about the railroad, and she talks to various rank and file workers, at Taggart Transcontinental. They know the truth and they tell her the truth. Dagny Taggart runs the railroad. Jim Taggart's just a blowhard. They recognize that,
and Eddie is the one whom she can trust to tell her the whole thing.
Yeah,
and he doesn't fool around. Yeah. And there's even sort of a bond between them. At one point, James Taggart says to Cheryl, "Don't just stand there looking like Eddie Willers." And she says, "I like Eddie Willers. Right. He's honest."
So I have a few points to make. One is, I think Eddie comes across as benevolent, really nice, whether it's his tenderness towards Dagny, he's monitoring to make sure that he's her watchdog for her time, or whether on autopilot, he gives the bum a dime, or with the oak tree, he just never wants, this is something children should be protected from, he thought that oak tree, you could pick the tree up and swing it and the whole earth would come with it. And you just get the sense of his benevolence. A second point, which is also benevolent but just, he says, Mr. Reardon, when he loses his medal, he said, they're not doing it in my name. They're doing it in the name of the public. I want you to know it is not in my name. And
Right.
you get this sense of he gives himself a voice, and it's that he's not so bottled up that he doesn't express himself, although he's very, when he's with John Galt, he's so eager to pour everything out at the cafeteria that when questions arise, like when John Galt says motive power, when Eddie says motive power, you don't know how important that is.
Right.
Why are you acting like that? Or when he mentions Dagny is with, has a relationship.
Where are you going? Yeah. What's wrong with you?
And
Yeah.
Eddie will ask the questions, and it's really good to learn that you can know how to ask the questions. It's another skill to know how to answer the questions for yourself, to take them and really start putting the pieces together, not just implicitly, but to take control, so that he learns how to introspect.
Well, he's on the path. That's one of the reasons why the conversations with Galt go the way they do, because he says, Dagny, what are they doing to her? Why are they torturing her for saving their lives?
Yeah. Oh, he's getting, and
yeah.
there are several moments. I mean, Eddie grows so much in, as I mentioned earlier, that ribbon cutting ceremony.
Yeah.
John Galt
not going to be. Yeah.
Oh my gosh. Do you know how many times I channel Eddie? Because it's like, okay, stand, we're going to take a picture, and it's not going to be a phony, and he just turns his back to it. I'm cutting the ribbon once, get whatever you can get.
Get out of the way.
And then he feels like he's a fraud. I mean, it's his integrity that makes him feel like he's a fraud to be in Dagny's place. But then he earns that place. He takes charge as his role goes on. And so,
he also has he has a job being her replacement, because someone else, the kind of person James Taggart wants, society respectable and so on. Yeah. That wouldn't be any good. It's actually better for the John Galt line and for Dagny, for Eddie.
But he doesn't feel it. He feels like he's a fraud initially, but then he grows out of that. And she just demonstrates, Ayn Rand demonstrates how invaluable your own choice making is on all of these seemingly, day-to-day issues. But he just grows. I mean, that moment of cutting the ribbon, Eddie grew. Eddie is not going to be a phony. Imagine James Taggart in front of that, in that moment.
Right.
Can we do it? Can we do it again? Yeah.
Right. A couple of points occurred to me when you two were speaking. One, that great line, when Eddie says to John Galt, motive power, you don't know how important that is. He's unaware. He's speaking to the man who has redefined motive power in both physics and philosophy. What constitutes a breakthrough motor, and identifying that the reasoning mind is the motor that that drives human progress and makes prosperity possible. So the irony, the irony in that scene is just brilliant. There's so much in Atlas Shrugged you have to go back and reread, because the first time going through, you're just necessarily going to miss it. But the other point, what you were saying about benevolence, and when Reardon himself is thinking about Reardon Medal, and how difficult the 10-year labor was to invent it, and the torture that he's been put through by his family and by the government for having done so, and he's introspecting, and he's thinking, what did you expect when you were doing all this work, that for the medal, that it would be in a world of, be introduced into a world of other great minds like Ellis Wyatt, who could use it to increase their own productivity, and really, yes, definitely, and that it would be used gratefully by people like Eddie Willers, who couldn't match your accomplishment, but who recognized that and expressed a great deal of gratitude, honest gratitude. And Reardon's touched by that. He said, yes,
Yeah,
yes,
yeah. Even it's when Francisco is trying to get him to understand for whom he's working, and that's really nice actually when he brings in Eddie Willers, Francisco does, and describes him
right.
just as you said, um, and give a moment's silent thanks to the man who gave them more than they could give him. Yeah,
It's very
yeah,
touching.
that's Eddie, and it says, "Yes," said Reardon gently.
Right.
So, and I don't know if we ordinarily think of Reardon as being a gentle kind of guy, but it's as if, the gentleness is an expression of, that's, it goes along with Eddie, and Eddie having a kind of quiet quiet strength to him. What you're mentioning
And
before.
the
Yeah,
gentleness shows that Renan has a certain affection for Eddie,
yeah,
that he has
and
affection
then
for honest,
yeah,
honest every man who, who can't match the gift that the genius gives them, but who could certainly express a great deal of honest and sincere gratitude, for that gift, and do
And
the
and it
best he
was,
can.
and you remember the breakfast scene, with the payment being extended, and Reardon just comes out with it, and Eddie says, how do you say thanks for something like that? And then Reardon explains what's behind it, and it's a really nice scene because, well, for one thing, it goes against the idea that that there's only one kind of profit, and taking advantage of Taggart Transcontinental situation would not actually be to the advantage of Reardon. But I think it's just sort of a nice human scene between the two of them, and and yet it's also a way of doing business. But you know something? It's funny. Eddie calls him Mr. Reardon, and Reardon calls him Eddie. And I think it's not just that their position, and it's not just their age, but I think it would. I can't quite see Reardon saying Mr. Of course, he knows Eddie, but still, he's still Eddie.
right,
Yeah,
right.
And in that scene.
There's a hierarchy of talent and genius and achievement here, and the respect, that goes with it. So it's right and proper, that Eddie should look up to Hank Reardon, and and call and address him in that very, respectful way, and that it's right and proper that Reardon should address Eddie in a friendly way. But there's they're simply at different levels of not just ability, but of achievement, and it's simply honest to recognize that, and deal with it in that way.
And Eddie can express a range of emotions, although you don't picture him as very
Oh yeah.
emotional.
Oh,
But
at the trial, it's sort of what a man does instead of crying. And then
yeah,
at another scene, he's actually sobbing. Yeah.
right. He also gets really angry with Jim when for getting at the beginning with the Mexican branch line to San Sebastian. They've taken all the parts, and that's when they're ordering red and metal, and Jim doesn't.
Hmm.
He gets really indignant, angry with Jim. So there are moments when Eddie gives himself a little, that ability to express himself, and that's his integrity too, that he's giving himself that.
Hmm. Yeah,
So,
I think that's true.
so how would we? I know it's we have a few more minutes, but I'm thinking, how would you wrap up? Do each of you want to speak to how you would package Eddie? How would you encapsulate the character of Eddie?
Well, I could say a couple of things. I think Eddie Will is the moral best of every man, and I think that's what you know that's thematically, I think, what Ayn Rand is showing us. Eddie has an important plot point here, but I think that's thematically what Ayn Rand is showing us, and why I had this ongoing conversation for 20 years as to what happens to Eddie Willers, after the events of the novels concluded. And I don't know if you want to hear me tell that story again. I could do it briefly, but
I've always loved your ending, even though this time when I was reading the book, I'm saying, oh no, Ayn Rand has too many clues throughout that it doesn't look very hopeful. But I loved your ending where you had, I guess you can tell it.
Yeah, I think it is hopeful because Eddie has powerful friends. Dagny loves him as her kid brother, and Francisco loves him as, Dagny's brother. And they have powerful planes powered by John Galt's engines. They will look for him, and Dagny has reason to know that he's somewhere along the track of the Atlantic Southern, and all they have to do is follow the track, which I think, given who Dagny and Francisco are, they'll do it, and they will find him. They'll find the stalled train. The question, of course, is, will Eddie still be alive? He might have died. Since he's out in the desert and he won't leave the train, I don't know how much water there is on the train, but in a matter of days he'll be dead of dehydration. So I don't know, but that, I think, we can extrapolate from the characters of Dagny and Francisco, and why Eddie is such a value to them. Then I simply apply Ayn Rand's benevolent universe premise to that, and pure speculation that they find him in time, they save him, they bring him back to the valley where he morally belongs. And when it's time to go back and rebuild the world, he marries Gwen Ives, Riordan's executive secretary. She's dead, honey.
Oh, that's right. That's right. Oh my God. But he saves her in advance. We're rewriting the whole book.
Yeah. I mean, Eddie and Cheryl would make a good couple, but I think Eddie and Gwen also make a good couple. Riordan's executive secretary, and they live in New Jersey, halfway between Eddie's job in New York and Gwen's job in Philadelphia. But that part of it's all speculation. I do think they'll search. I do think Dagny and Francisco will search for Eddie, and they'll find him. The question is whether
I never thought of that the railroad. And Dagny flies a plane. They fly planes. Get to
what planes they have powered by John Galt's.
Right, because they save them in New York, right? I mean, at the end of the book.
Yeah, right.
On the torture rack. So yeah, no, I can see that. And Shoshana, I asked you the question. So let me just add one more thing and then I'll jump to you. But I see it as Eddie represents, like you said, the average man, but I know I related to Eddie throughout the book. Mm-hmm. I related to Dagny and others too, but he's really got two slogans in his mind. One is, your days are numbered. And that's that twilight feeling at the beginning of the book. And things are happening. He's not afraid of death. He's not afraid of fear. He's afraid of the unknown, that something is happening that seems not causal, that he can't explain. And that bothers him tremendously. So that's one of the phrases, your days are numbered. And the other one is the benevolent universe premise one, which is from ocean to ocean. And he adds in his mind forever. So I love the idea, Andy, of your saying from ocean to ocean wins, not your days are numbered. Well,
the strikers win in the end. And, and Eddie not only belongs with them because of his character, but he is very, very, he's family. He's family, not biologically, but he's family to both Dagny and Francisco.
Right. And Shoshana?
Okay, well, Eddie, it's very hard to think of the end of Eddie. And I think that in maybe a more naturalistic world, with the benevolent universe premise, there'd be an attempt to save him because, after all, he's dear to Dagny and he was John Galt's friend for all that time. The other piece, though, is that he said, if the railroad goes down, I'm going down with it. And he hasn't changed that. And even, turning down the covered wagons is a way of holding on to the shape of Taggart Transcontinental, even though it's like the oak tree, there's nothing inside anymore. And that's his choice. Now, if we want to save him, I think that he actually needs to be sure he's going to stop supporting any possible destroyers and join the strike. And not just by default.
He has to take the oath. Right.
Yeah. And so it's not just by default. And so that's why I think there'd have to be more of a story in order. It's tragic. There's a kind of tragedy there that he made a choice that has led to a dead end. And there's something like that with Cheryl. And I know you think that Cheryl and Eddie would be good together. And I think there's something there because they're both in love with Dagny, right? Yeah. I mean, Cheryl thinks that James Taggart is Dagny.
Right.
But I think that ultimately what we have with Eddie is, an honest person who followed through on even his own limitations, and that's where it leaves him, on a frozen train that he can't, that's broken, that he can't start, and that he doesn't have it within him to make a motor, understand fully the nature of the world that he's living in. And I don't know if I want to call him an average man, because what's that? He's a non-genius. He's a non-productive genius. I don't know what average would be, but what he is someone who does very well in many areas of his life. He is brave, and he speaks the truth when he sees it. And he's also someone who, if the book were about him, you mentioned he grows and develops, then there's more. He could learn more, but the book isn't about him. Right. The book is not about the education of Eddie Willers, and Eddie Willers is a secondary character who is a good contrast with the evil characters, and he's also a good contrast with the characters who do learn, or who learned before we ever got into the book, and who understand the nature of the world, because the question that he asks at the beginning, that he finally gets the answer to at the end, not just who's John Galt, but the question about, what should we do in this world? And then as he's there on the train, he says, you knew the answer all along. And then he finally knows it. In the name of the best within us, that is the best within us. But he can't start the train just because he now knows it. He had to, all sorts of other things had to happen in order for him to be able to start that train, and he can't do it.
Right. So two different endings, yours and Andy's.
Well, Ayn Rand, one thing is clear. Ayn Rand is very clear here in deliberately leaving the fate of Eddie Willers ambiguous, because he's still alive at the end. We don't know if he dies. He may or he may not. But certainly Ayn Rand is showing us that the fate of the best of every man, the honest, as Shoshana, you put it, the best, moral best of the non-geniuses depends upon the fate of the geniuses. When the Atlases are free, they create wealth, they create freedom, they create wealth, and the Eddie Willers and the Gwen Ives of the world will do very well. The Cheryl Brooks of the world, can do very well. The morally upright best of every man and every woman. But when the geniuses are shackled, and they're not free to create, and not create a free society, and not create any kind of intellectual or material wealth, then every man and every woman, no matter their moral character is great, but they don't have the ability to make human life possible. And so even at the end, Eddie's fate still depends on the geniuses. Can Dagny and Riordan find him? Not Riordan. Can Dagny and Francisco find him and save him? He can't save himself. Dagny could save him. So again, you're showing the way the moral best of every man and every woman depends upon the fate of the geniuses. And I think
that's a very important point, because if you don't get that, if Eddie is just saved, you don't get that point that his fate depends, just as my fate would depend on it if I were on that train, and somebody else saving me. And that's true for all of us in areas that we're not expert in.
Which is why we shouldn't get on trains that are not going to go anywhere. No, seriously.
Yeah, why we don't go to the auto mechanic to have a appendicitis surgery. We go to the people who are expert in that field. But yeah, I mean, definitely, I wouldn't be able to start the train. In real life, Eddie might go with the covered wagon until he finds some town where he can buy a car or rent a car or something and start driving back. But that's not Ayn Rand's point. He stays with the train. Ayn Rand showing these other points, his commitment to industrial civilization and to human prosperity on Earth, and his inability to make that happen. He needs the geniuses to make that happen.
I would also say that he's an important character. Actually, this is true, that he was an important character in Ayn Rand's own psychology in thinking about this novel, because years before she planned the book that she was going to call The Strike, years before she had that idea for a book, when she was in Soviet Russia, she's a teenager, she was planning a book in which there was a very gifted, powerful, intelligent woman who had an assistant. And that the name of that assistant was going to be the title of that book, and it was Eddie Willers.
Wow.
So it's
Oh,
as
is
if,
that right?
you know, So Eddie Willers was always, you know,
Yeah.
that kind of character was someone who was important to her and was always there. No, I have to
Yes.
say, I am glad she didn't call this one Eddie Willers. I don't think that would have been the world's best idea. But you know, in her mind, he stood for something important.
Yes, for many things. So if I could give Eddie Willers, we can end with this if you'd like, unless you want some final comments after. But if I ask myself, what one thing would I want to give Eddie? One, and it would be the skill to understand his own emotions so he doesn't have unearned guilt. You know, he gets angry at himself for remembering the oak tree, or he shuts down his emotions. I shouldn't be thinking of Dagny instead of, oh, that, you know, he has a curiosity about observing James like a scholar, like what the heck type of human being or pretend human being is this James Taggart? But he's harder on himself. He jumps to kind of shut down, close down things. So I would love to give him the knowledge of how to introspect freely, or when he's with Galt and Galt says, you know, has an unusual response, for Eddie to learn how to inquire, but to also ask himself questions so things don't remain the way they were, whatever he learned from the minister back then. He can clean house.
You know,
So what would you like to give him, or what final statement?
I would like to give Eddie Willis a cell phone, you know, so he could call Dagny and let her know where he is.
I hope there are cell towers out there.
Yeah, in Arizona in 1957, you know, whenever that was. Oh, this is the future.
Oh, I love that, Andy.
Yeah, but I get your point. I get your point. And let me think about that while Shoshana. I'm sure Shoshana has something to say.
Well, you know, I think that he has so many good values, and I mean, he understands the wisdom that Danny communicates to Cheryl. You know, what is it that allowed you to remain unmangled? To, you know, my life is important, and I place nothing above the verdict of my own mind. And I think Eddie does know that. He just needs to keep using his mind.
Yeah.
He needs to use it more. So I think we're in agreement.
Right, and it just occurred to me, we're talking about Gwen Ives, who's also a very, you know, positive and sympathetic character. Who you just get a slight hint. Eddie's in love with Dagny. You get a slight hint, you know, that Gwen's in love with Hank Reardon. But yeah, I'd like to tell Eddie, work is really, really, really important, but there's other areas of life. You're a really good man. You should find yourself a good woman, you know, a girlfriend, and have a romantic relationship. He's evidently you know, he's alone. From what we know about his story, there's no mention of him having a girlfriend or ever having. Now I understand he's in love with Dagny, but
Dagny every day.
Yeah,
and
yeah.
he thinks that it's not clear how much he knows about Dagny and Francisco. You know, just that
I think he could suspect that they were lovely.
Yeah, right. But it's sort of that isn't something that he could talk about with Dagny. And so from his standpoint, it looks as if Dagny also is living a solitary romantic life.
Yeah, romantically, you know, she does.
So if Dagny doesn't need a boyfriend, Eddie Willis doesn't need a girlfriend.
Because they have each other.
Now that's not really true. That's not actually true, but I think that could be a way it stands in his mind.
Hypothetically, and the antecedent is false. You know, Dagny does need a boyfriend, Eddie does need a girlfriend.
Right.
We all do that
right, but he doesn't know that. You see, he doesn't know that.
Right. That goes back to Ellen's point that she'd like to give him more psychological awareness, which you know, I agree with. It makes sense. Yeah. So anyway, final verdict: good man, good person, morally upright. You know, a person worthy of respect. And all the giants in this story, they do respect him, and they treat him, you know, with kindness, and they treat him respectfully.
And better than a feudal serf, which is what he's called. Better than a feudal serf.
Yes. Final words.
Yeah, no, just that I think that expression of feudal serf goes with him, and he's more than that.
Well, I think he says it ironically. I don't think he literally believes that he's a feudal serf. feudalism was not very a system very conducive to human life on Earth. And he was very committed to American freedom and industrial civilization and prosperity.
Yeah.
And I think my final words are the things I love about Eddie, meaning Ayn Rand, because she created him, right? Are the gifts, the rich examples, whether it's the oak tree, the ribbon cutting ceremony, the justice he gives to Hank Rearden. It's that it informs my life. When I remember once I could go on a trip with some people. It might have been a day trip. I've been trying to remember what the actual thing was, what the actual example was, because it was a while back. And I thought, oh, this is how Eddie Willers felt with the carriage. These are not my type of people. I cannot spend a day with them. And it's like, I would rather stay here, not die, obviously. But, she gives us the words and the images and examples that we can bring into our own life and that inform us. The oak tree is another one. When you see something and something points you, like the news, you turn on the news. We don't have to go there, but you turn on the news. It's like, how do you capture your benevolence? You need a way to do that. He will do it by talking to the man in the cafeteria, John Paul. But there are just that knowledge that you need to consciously refuel your the benevolent universe premise in yourself. You have to keep it going. Anyway, other final thoughts?
I suspect that could be a wrap on Eddie Willers.
Okay, we'll wrap up on Eddie Willers. Thank you both, and thank you, Razi, behind the scenes.
Yeah. Thank you, Dr. Kenna, Dr. Milgram, and
thanks, Auntie. Thanks, Ellen.
You notice we're Dr. Kenner and Dr. Milgram, and he's Auntie.
Yeah, that's okay. And
I'm always Ellen. Yeah.
Big boss man, Razi Ginsburg, El Duce. We have to thank him for the leader, for setting this up. Thank you. So thank you, Razi.
Thank you, Razi. Thank you for remembering.
Thank you.